Welcome back to Plan Dulce, a podcast where we highlight the work and voice of Latina planners, educators, community leaders, artists, and experts shaping Latina communities. I'm your host, Bryan Lima, and today we are diving into a conversation about the arts. A little bit about me. I am a planner and filmmaker based out of Los Angeles. My pronouns are he, him, his. I have short black hair. I have brown eyes. I have these thick black frames for glasses. I have a short beard. I'm wearing a white T-shirt and a gray cardigan. And my background includes a green couch and two picture frames and a white wall. In introducing some characteristics about my appearance, I just introduced myself as an example of an accessible introduction for individuals who may be visually impaired or individuals who may be listening. Today's guest is Álvaro D. Márquez, pronouns they, them, theirs, an artist, researcher, and philanthropy professional. They grew up in the working class immigrant community of East Salinas, California, and reside in Los Angeles County. Descendant of three generations of migrant field workers. They hold a BA in U.S. History from Brown University, an MA in American Studies and Ethnicity from the University of Southern California, and an MFA in Printmaking from CSU Long Beach. They are also currently pursuing a PhD in Cultural Studies from Claremont Graduate University. Their work explores displacement as a key modality in the development of Western settler colonial expansion, encompassing issues around indigenous disposition, homelessness, segregation, and gentrification. At the root of their interdisciplinary practice is an examination of the privatization of land as a commodity and the long-lasting effects of intersection of printmaking, installation, and sculpture. They have exhibited their work across the United States, Mexico, and Germany, and their work has been collected by the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College, and the United States Library of Congress. They currently work as a senior officer of communications and arts at the California Community Foundation, and have previously taught as adjunct faculty at the University of Southern California Roski School of Art and Design, CSU Long Beach School of Art, and CSU Los Angeles Department of Chicana, and Latino Studies. Álvaro, welcome to Plan Dulce.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's an honor and pleasure to be here.
Álvaro, before jumping into questions, can you describe your appearance for our audience listening or viewing our episode today?
Yes, I'm a light-skinned person of Latinx descent wearing clear frame glasses and a gray button-down shirt. I have a salt and pepper beard and a receding hairline and brown eyes. My hair is dark brown, and in the background of my screen, there's some artwork as well as a certificate I received from LA County for a public artwork that I led.
Great, thank you. To start off, I've shared a bit about you already, but it would be great if we could take a step back and if you could share what sparked your interest in history and art. Did you always know you wanted to be an artist, or did you stumble upon it?
Yeah, I really love this question because my love of history really starts with my relationship with my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, Jose Isabel Garcia. We used to call him Chabelito. And he was a bracero in the US from the 1950, I think starting 1952. And he was born in 1920 in Mexico and grew up at the time of the Cristero Revolt in post-revolutionary Mexico, which I won't go into, but it was a really tumultuous period in Mexican history. And I grew up listening to his stories. He was an avid storyteller, and even though he was not formally educated, he told stories with really sharp memory. And for me, that was part of the oral tradition in working class communities. But his his stories about where he came from, the life he lived, and and just all of these, I mean, adventures I would see them as when he was traveling to the U.S. as a bracero or witnessing, people getting gunned down in Mexico during this Cristero revolt. it just sparked that curiosity about the past in me. And I always credit him for my love of history. And it was something that I kind of dove deeper into when I was in high school. But by the time I got to college, I just realized that was something that I was really passionate about. And in terms of art, I mean, I was making art since I could hold a pencil when I was a kid. I would draw all the time. I've made art my whole life, but I didn't really fully pursue it until I was in my 30s, really. I had to build the confidence to show it to others because I didn't really, growing up in a working poor immigrant community, I didn't have access to art instruction. So I never really was able to build up all those formal skills. I'm not the most formally gifted artist. I think hopefully I bring some conceptual rigor to my artwork, but it's something that I've had to work on. And I made artwork my whole life, but I never really showed it to anybody. It was very personal. It was an avenue of expression. I'm very open. I've dealt with suicidal depression since I was about 11, 12 years old. And my artwork was really just for me to process my emotions. And it wasn't until I left my first PhD program when I was almost 30 that I decided that I wanted to pursue that. And it took a lot of courage because I had a lot of insecurities about it. And I took an art class in college, and it was my senior year, and I realized in college, like, shoot, I chose a wrong major, or I should have double major. But, my mom had good intentions, but as an immigrant herself, she would always tell me, don't study art. You're gonna suffer. It's not a real job. Get a real job. And so I listened to her, and it wasn't until I was in my 30s I said, you know what? Screw it. I have to try this because I call my MFA my YOLO degree. It was like I don't want to have this regret in my life, if that makes sense.
No, I totally understand that. I feel like a lot of our like elders, especially our your first generation or so on and so forth, there is like that like financial insecurity that leads into like not want us to pursue art in that sense. It's like follow the money, but like to
Yeah.
get eventually, I think like you were able to build your path toward that. So it's really great to hear. So, Alvaro, you are a trained historian. Was this important to your art practice?
Yeah, I grew up in a working class farm worker community, as you guys mentioned, and I just, that community was shaped by inequality. There was a lot of gang violence in the 90s and just a real lack of opportunities. And this experience really shaped my work as a scholar and an artist, and it really politicized me at a young age. And in terms of history, I've always loved history, as I mentioned, as a way of understanding how the world we live in came to be. And because of the stories that I heard growing up, I just was naturally inclined to think about the past. I've been a nerd my whole life. I grew up next to the library. I practically lived in the library because it was a rough community, not always safe to be outside. I would just read all the time. And I always had this passion for historical fiction. And in high school, I took an AP history class with my professor, Mr. Manuel Lopez, and I actually was lucky enough to pass the AP history exam. And it just sparked something in me where I was like, wait, I think I can do this. This is something that's interesting, and I have this ability to articulate my thoughts in written form. And that was really what propelled me to get even into Brown University, which, as a working class kid, I became even more politicized. I was one of the few kids on financial aid at Brown. It's a very liberal but very elitist institution. I'm saddened by the events that happened recently there. It was a very formative experience, and in a lot of ways, my artwork is deeply historical because it is an extension of my academic practice. In a lot of ways, whether I'm doing scholarly work, because I wrote an honors thesis at Brown on the Chicana Chicano movement in my community of Salinas, and I was invested in that history. And I think in my artwork, what I'm really trying to do is to denaturalize the world around us, to show that where we ended up is not inevitable, but the result of like social, political, historical, and geographical processes that have shaped us. And so a lot of my nerdier interests once I got to college is really understanding the long history of colonialism and how it has shaped the built environment, but also knowledge, the production of race and gender. And it's something that I learned a lot from decolonial scholars. When my first time in the PhD program, I was studying with this amazing scholar, Macarena Gomez Baris, who is very formative to my thinking. And so when I dropped out of the PhD program, I said, I want to keep pursuing this line of inquiry, but I want to do it through art.
So, in continuing with your art, tell us about your studio and your interdisciplinary practice.
Yeah, for me, I always say that making is a way of thinking. And another way of saying that is that this is my perhaps nerdy way of saying it, but art is just another modality of social inquiry, right? Like it's just another way of exploring the world around us. And so I dive into readings and archives and I produce artwork as a response to that, always with the focus on social and political commentary. In a lot of ways, I have what I describe as an archival art practice, which is really rooted in my training as a historian, because that's what you do as a historian. You go into an archive and you tell a story about what has happened and how we came to be. And because I love the archive and making connections, my artwork, it's perhaps not for everybody. It's very nerdy. I'm not always, it's not always marketable because I'm not really necessarily focused on making just a pretty object. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not my approach. I really am interested in producing work that says something about the world and that kind of scratches the intellectual curiosity that I have of me asking why.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's making me think right now. I love how you express that. You describe yourself as a printmaker at heart as well, but you've expanded your practice into other media. Why was this important to create your ideas?
Well, I guess I should give a little background. I used to
Oh,
draw
go
in
ahead.
paint. I used to draw in paint all the time, but honestly I was never really good at it. I have ADHD. I'm too impatient. Like the painting, I just never caught on to it. And when I left my PhD program, the first PhD program in 2011, I took a workshop at the Center for Arts in Eagle Rock, and it was an introduction to printmaking, and I was instantly hooked. There's something meditative about I can wax poetic about printmaking. It's a process-based art form. You have to delay gratification, be very present, and that kind of taught me a lot of lessons about life. To not focus, because I'm an impatient person. I'm always trying to get to the end result. And printmaking, it forces you to slow down and enjoy the process. And I think that's like a metaphor for how I want to live my life: is stop focusing on where I'm trying to get to and enjoy where I am. And my printmaking, I started off, like I said, painting and drawing. Then I found printmaking, became obsessed. My early work was really illustrative and focused on my interest in comic books and their relevant aesthetics. Growing up, comic books were my escape. They're part of how I learn English. I was a ESL student in kindergarten and first grade. We spoke only Spanish at home, and comic books were my entry into literacy and into the English language. And I wanted to, in my early work, copy that visual vocabulary. But I was always kind of inquieto. I was like, that's not enough. That's kind of boring. I always want a next challenge. And I had a professor at Cal State Long Beach who told me something that took me like a year to figure out. And he said, because I told him I'm really stuck. Like, I don't want to just be drawing stuff. I want to do more. And he told me some artwork illustrates theory and other work demonstrates it. And it took me like a year to process that. And so I really wanted to move beyond traditional notions of art into something where I could really nerd out and dive into my PhD training. Uh, and you go in a lot of ways where the archive takes you. So I stopped planning objects that I was going to make, and instead I focus on questions, and that eventually led me to what I'm supposed to make. And that approach is just very gratifying to me. Like I like trying new things. I kind of reinvent my practice every few years, try something different. Because as much as I will always at heart be a printmaker, I found it limiting to just stay to those parameters of a traditional print.
Yeah. And as someone who's also neurodivergent, I understand that like your brain sometimes just takes you different places, and
I need that dopamine fix. Like I once I
yeah,
figured something out, I get bored and I need a new challenge.
yeah, it's like I mean, this goes on to our next question. It just feels like your brain just like the map is ever changing, right? Correct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely,
So
absolutely.
Yeah. To on to our next question. Where did your interest in maps and geography begin, and how have you used them in your practice?
I think it really started. I told you I wrote an honors thesis when I was an undergrad a long time ago.
Hmm.
I received a fellowship at Brown to write this research project, and I started looking into the history of my community. And the first thing that came to mind, where I grew up was called the Alisal area. My high school was called Alisal. The elementary was called Alisal. The middle school I went to was called El Sausal, and I was like, where do these names come from? And then after doing some digging, I realized they were the ranchos. They were the colonial ranchos. When California was colonized by the Spanish, it was Rancho El Sausal, Rancho La Lizal. And I was like, that opened up these interesting questions. But when I was a PhD student at USC, I was trained by a radical geographer and prison abolitionist named Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And that got me thinking about the social construction of space and how geography intersects with race, gender, and socioeconomic class. She's one of she's a superstar. I was so honored to learn from her. And now that I'm back in grad school, I'm reading stuff from on carceral geographies, looking at the relationship between the prison system, policing, and geography. I'm reading the work of Neil Smith and radical geographers who look at the social construction of space. So I really, maybe a little over 10 years ago, like I said, the archive takes you where it takes you. And I started looking at maps as archives of power relations. And I started realizing they helped me connect issues like colonization, the privatization of land and natural resources, to issues like redlining, gentrification, and homelessness. And for me, all these contemporary issues have roots in colonization and its use of cartography to map out space. And they have implications for what your relationship is to displacement and even to police violence.
Yeah, which are all issues that have been affecting our communities, people of color for generations, right?
Yeah.
Uh, in addition to that, can you share and talk about some of your creations and tell us why you wanted to talk about themes of history, indigenous disposition, displacement, gentrification, and private property, like etc. Like for example, your the past is a copy of a copy.
Yeah, I think, that project has two names. It's either called The Past is a Copy of a Copy or Geometries of Displacement. That was really the culmination of my MFA work at Cal State Long Beach. Like I said, after hearing that comment from my professor that some artwork illustrates theory and other artwork demonstrates it, I thought, well, what would it mean to go into an archive of maps and integrate printmaking and all this stuff that I was learning and embroidery and turn it into like basically like a research paper in the shape of an art object. And that's where geometries of displacement comes from. But if you look at the picture here, it's a really horrible place name. There's no denying this. I hate showing this, but it's also just the reality that racism is imprinted in our cartographies. And I was going into archives. This particular image I found of the South Bay near Cal State Dominguez Hills. I went into the archive at Cal State Dominguez Hills, and the archivist showed me this map, and I was stunned by it. I mean, it upset me, but it kind of like cemented in me that like these histories of race and class and gender are literally embedded into the landscape. And this is an area near present day Cal State Dominguez Hills that used to be called by this name. And if we switch the slide, I used that map as just a way to say, well, let's see how can abstraction come into play this? Like what shapes are coming out of the map and how can I take this like really horrible piece of history and transform it into something. And so in class, I had access to the print studio and I produced this version of it. But if you change the slide, I ended up getting invited to do a project with Self Help Graphics and Art here in Bow Heights. And I realized like I wanted to take that map and turn it into something that could make a commentary. And in this piece here called Your Presence Counts, Tu Presencia Cuenta, I'm making all these connections that I was finding through my readings, through the historical research I was doing to kind of, Los Angeles is home to a lot of unhoused people. And there's this paradoxical like invisibility of unhoused people, but hyper visibility of their tents. For years you would drive around LA, you see tents everywhere. And there's a relationship between that and policing because unhoused people, Skid Row is one of the biggest open air sort of like carceral landscapes in Los Angeles. And so I was trying to draw that relationship between the policing of unhoused people, their tents, and then you see the Spanish galleons on the coast to make a reference that these are rooted in colonial histories. And I don't want to go too far into it because I don't want to distract us, but there is a relationship between colonial notions of private property, the maps that they use to create those ranchos that colonize and displace indigenous people, to contemporary practices of displacement and policing. And that's something that I'm exploring in my graduate work, but this is really like what started connecting those things. And if you change the slide, this is my geometries of displacement installation that I did as a thesis project at Cal State Long Beach, and I ended up having a show during the pandemic at Self Help Graphics and Art to actually show it. And it shows digital reproductions of archival maps, lino cut pieces, embroidery, and string. And this is from 2020. And this is like, I don't know if you've seen that meme of the guy from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia where he's
Yes.
he's got that conspiracy. I was like, this is my
Pepe Silva.
conspiracy. Yeah, I was like, this is my conspiracy. It's all connected. Like I have a map of indigenous settlements in Tavangar, which is the Tongva name of Los Angeles. I have a map of the colonial Spanish ranchos. I have maps of the homeowners loan corporation redlining maps, which encoded racial segregation onto the landscape. And then I have a map of gentrification patterns. And I'm basically saying these are all connected. And I use these different iconographic references through linocut to make those connections. So we can look at details if you move on to the next slide. Here's a detail where I embroidered the maps to bring out these shapes, and I'm just making all these connections to show like, hey, this is all connected. And like I said, this is kind of like my research paper turned into an art project. And for me, there's a historical relationship between cartography as a colonial practice rooted in the privatization of land that leads to issues like redlining. This is all placemaking practices that are historically interconnected, and I'm trying to draw those connections through this artwork. And the homeowners loan corporations, I mean, that's a rich archive right there. I mean, there you have those maps all over the country, and it was basically it essentially decided who could buy a house where according to what level of risk the property was deemed. So it would shape who can get a mortgage, and it shaped the racial landscape. And so for me, that's very much connected to those colonial maps. These are spatial ordering processes that have shaped the landscape and have social and political determinants. So if you go on to the next slide, here's a close-up process shots of geometry of displacement where I took the colonial ranchos, and I used to think that there was no artist in my family, and then I realized I was being sexist. My grandmother used to do embroidery. That's an art form.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so I decided that in this project, I was going to embroider the maps to kind of like speak to my grandmother's artistic legacy. It's also like a political intervention because embroidery is considered woman's work and sort of seen as less than in the art world, but it's an art form. And I wanted to honor that history of my grandmother as a maker into this project. And so on the left, you see the colonial ranchos that shaped Los Angeles, or Tavangar, as we would call it. And then on the right, you see a close up. That shape that you see there on the right hand side is actually Bow Heights. And that was a red line district. And so, like, that is historically linked to like the gentrification that Bow Heights is facing, the fact that it was a community of Jewish, Japanese American, and Latino, Latinx people in the East Side. And so I'm drawing out those connections through embroidery. And if you move on to the next slide, here's a map of gentrification patterns. UCLA has a project where they map gentrification patterns across Tavangar, aka LA County. So I use a copy of that map to embroider once more, and that's the process where I'm actually threading the needle with embroidery floss onto the map. I think there might be one more slide, or it might be the last one. I think that's the last one. So that kind of gives you a sense of sort of just a glimpse into how I use maps. I've been using maps for about 10 years, and we probably wouldn't have time to see more samples, but that's just kind of like that was the culmination of years of grad research that I did around maps and cartography and race and place.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that, that maps are, you know, part of our history, and, they are a form of storytelling of, you know, yeah, like that first image, just seeing the title of that map, to see how, you know, people of color have been affected by, different discriminatory practices, and, just love
Yeah.
that you're doing that in your work.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's irrefutable proof. Like you can deny racism, but that is a fact. That
Hmm.
racist place name is in the archive. You can't erase that. And so,
Hmm.
in this political climate where people want to like gaslight you and say, "Oh, there's no racism. This is all your fantasy." Like you can't negate that. That's evidence, and that's lies at the root of my archival practice. And I could say a lot more about maps. I mean, they are our objects. They're rooted in colonialism. Cartography as a practice emerged from colonial ventures, and so I think there's a historical continuity. And I think I'm just fascinated by maps. I will probably spend more time exploring maps because I think they're an archive of power relations, and they kind of speak to the social construction of space. And I think as city planners think about what they're intervening in, you're intervening in these histories, you're intervening in these processes, right? So it's really important to think critically about how you reproduce power relations through spatial ordering.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, I was just thinking, it's like the proof is in the print of like what you're saying. Like these maps are, evidence of, uh, yeah, like some of the atrocities that have happened to our communities, throughout history.
Yeah,
And, I love that you're using cartography to kind of flip it on its head, instead of, you know, using it as a how historically is, they always used to like, mapping to like, this is what this belongs to us. It's like, well, our people have always been here, so it's
yeah.
like, yeah, I love how you're using that. Okay, so with that, what advice would you give Latin students exploring careers in the arts or other interdisciplinary subjects?
So I got a few thoughts on this one. First, I would say don't be afraid to suck at first. Like, don't be afraid. You're not going to be an expert when you first start. And it's very easy to get discouraged. If you look at your artwork, you compare yourself to others. As they say, comparison is the thief of joy. It's all a process. So, developing skills as an artist takes time and practice and what people call failure. It's all part of the learning process. Um, Secondly, I would say don't allow your self doubt to stop you from creating, and don't create for validation or to appease others. Make art for yourself and experiment as much as possible. And don't worry about whether or not people like it. That will come with practice. And if they resonate, great. If not, if only three people connect with your art, that's still a success. And the last thing I would say, and this is something that I live by, chase fear. If you're afraid, then you're doing something right. If you're comfortable, you're falling into routines. And it's hard because, part of the logic of the art world is that you create a recognizable brand and you do that for 20, 30 years so that you can become a commodity. I'm not interested in being a commodity. That's why I have a day job. I can make what I want to make under my own terms. And that's part of the negotiation that I've made that I do sell my artwork, but if it doesn't sell, I'm at peace with it. Like I had a solo show in 2023, didn't sell a thing, but I was proud of the pieces because I knew that the work was really weird and it was actually deconstructing maps. So taking map forms, deconstructing them and reconstructing them through abstract art. And I was afraid. I was doing something I had never done. And in my new body of work, I'm trying a whole new thing. And I really believe that like I chase that fear. Perhaps as a neurodivergent person, I need a new challenge, but I really believe that if you're afraid, then you're onto something.
Yeah, and it's like conquering that new fear to move on to the next thing. It's like
Yeah,
again, that dopamine hit. It's like, all right, what's next?
yeah.
How do you stay motivated when facing our current political climate and other challenges?
I mean, honestly, the main thing that I do is just staying connected with community and people who want to make this world a better place. Because it's so easy to read the news, get discouraged. There's so many horrible things going on, and I have this balance between staying informed and not falling into despair. And it's hard right now. And it's hard not to get discouraged. There's so much hate and division. You look at comments online, people are so hateful. But I focus on the small things that I can control and try not to focus on things that are out of my control. And that means that I still think a lot about what I can do every day to stay aligned with my values and try to work towards a better world. But there's so many things that are completely out of control. One person can't change the world. And that's why I say stay connected with community, because I think there's this fallacy in American culture that individuals make change. And that's not true. Community makes change. People working together make change. People in grassroots organizations, working across coalitions, working in networks. That's how you change the world. And so fight that isolation and be in community. And it took me forever to find my community, but once I found it, that gives me hope.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Historically, like like not just our people, but many people of color and many immigrants, the community has always been stronger together and in order to progress together, right? And yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like the capitalistic like the US is very individualistic, and I think that harms us as a whole. But I'm glad you spoke on that. What advice can you give urban planners or other professionals in creative spaces to collaborate better with artists in their community to advance social and spatial justice?
I love this question because we live in a society that undervalues creative labor. There's this paradox where people love what artists make, but they don't respect artistic practices, their intellectual practices, or the labor that goes behind it. And what I would say is that artists are creative problem solvers naturally, and they ask a lot of questions. So work with them not only to honor their skills and labor, but to see what connections they're making that other people aren't seeing. You know, Art isn't just about making pretty objects, although a lot of do that. There's a lot of thought that goes into it, and there are a lot of great artists that I'm surrounded by that I follow that are really asking really hard questions about the world we live in and things we take for granted. And I think artists are naturally inclined to question and challenge the status quo, and they're creative problem solvers. And so that's, from my place in philanthropy, I always tell my colleagues like the arts intersects with everything we do. We're a social justice funder. Funding the arts is about social justice, it's about economic opportunity, it's about youth development, it's about mental health. And so like artists are also drivers of civic change. And every successful movement going back to the abolition of slavery engaged in art in some form as a form of advocacy. So work with them, find those collaborations. And it goes back to the point that I said about working in community. We have so many silos that I think we have to build really broad coalitions, and artists should be a key part of those coalitions moving forward.
I don't know. What's the best part of being an artist today?
I think for me, there's a lot of challenges to being an artist. I'm not gonna lie to you. It's hard. The reason why I had to get a day job, because as an artist, you don't have health insurance, you don't have a retirement, you don't have all those structures to support you, and it's hard. But for me, the best part is simply the magic of making something with your hands and using your creativity. Life is full of art in everything that I do, but being an artist, like I said, is very hard. And so I can acknowledge the financial precarity that comes with it, but it's also a way of living outside of normative notions of what success is under capitalism. For a long time, I wasn't making a lot of money, but I had a life full of purpose. And so for me, that's the best part is that, at a young age, I graduated from Brown and then I backpacked for 3 years and I worked as a gardener, as a construction worker, as a cook in a nonprofit. I never wanted to live a normative life. And now that I've gotten older, I've made some concessions because I realized, hey, I need a 401k. I need health insurance. I have a son, right?
Yeah.
But there's something really beautiful about living a life outside of normative conceptions of what you're supposed to do with your life. And I think that's fundamentally what artists do.
Yeah, I like your self-awareness and self-acceptance of, yeah, you don't have to stick to a linear path or any, nor what's considered normal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That goes back to what I said about not living for other people's expectations. You know, I was a prisoner to other people's expectations, especially as a person of color who came from poverty and who was working class, right? Like I was always fighting to live up to this norm, to be like considered worthy, to be good enough. And once I let go of that, I allowed myself to just be who I want to be.
Is there any project or topic you've been working on that you want to highlight? Give a quick
Yeah,
shout
I've
out
got a
to?
few. I've got a few that I want to talk about. First of all, you know, I work at the California Community Foundation, where pretty much everything I do is using the arts for social justice. And I want to give a shout out to our CEO, Miguel Santana, who gave me a campaign this summer to work on in response to the ICE raids, and it's called Am I Next? And you can learn more about it at minextla.org, but it's basically using photography and photos, portraits of everyday Angelinos to ask, "Am I next?" Right? It's a way of using photography to say who's next. It starts with undocumented people, but we know that the dissolution of civic society is unraveling in front of us, in front of this authoritarian government. And I'm really proud of that project. At CCF, I also run our Fellowship for Visual Artists, which provides like $40,000 grants to artists. The next campaign launches in January. That's easily my favorite part of my job. In terms of my academic work, you know, I'm further exploring this interest in maps, and looking at how artists challenge these spatial orderings. And I wrote this research paper that, you know, I'm not saying it's any good, but I'm proud of it, and I'm gonna edit it and refine it for the next year and see if I can publish it. But it's really looking at how artists resist these spatial ordering practices through artistic forms. And in terms of my artistic practice, I do have a new body of work that's taking me back to comic books. I don't know if you're familiar with the Libro Vaquero. It's a comic book that used to circulate in Mexico and the US about the Wild West. And I'm using that as an archive to do mixed media collage pieces where I'm integrating everything that I know. And it's going to look at sort of masculinity in Mexican diasporic communities and how it relates to settler colonialism and these histories of the Wild West and anti-Indigenous sentiment. I'll make connections to cartography through the piece because I'm not letting go of maps. I'm always going to have maps in there. But it's a new direction in my work to kind of unpack, even though I'm non-binary, I was socialized as a male. And you know, I am a recipient of male privilege because I don't present in an androgynous or femme way. So it's a way of thinking through these questions of masculinity, and I'm sure I'll find a relationship between cartography and gender. It's there somewhere. I just haven't found it.
I'm pretty sure you will, and I'm yeah definitely looking forward for your work. And as an avid comic book fan, it's like, I'm looking forward to see what you can do with that. Um, what's one question you'd wish I had asked you, and how would you have answered it?
You know, I'm kind of a woo-woo emotional person, and I think a great question, you know, because we live in this society that shuns deep conversations, right? We sometimes stay at this superficial level of like niceties and politeness. And a question that I would love would be, what is the source of your greatest fears and insecurities, and how have you grown from them? You know, I think, you know, as I've mentioned before, I'm very open about this. I'm a suicide survivor. I've dealt with depression my whole life. I was deeply into addiction for many years. It sidelined my life. And, you know, my life has been messy. It's been circuitous. It was not a straight line. I've had weird routes to get to where I am, and I faced a lot of disappointment, but it has really made me who I am. And in my own sort of healing journey from all this trauma that I experienced as a child, I've come to realize that, you know, challenges in the world, they either break you or transform you. And the universe will keep throwing the same lessons at you until you learn your lesson. And I like to think I've learned some lessons now and I've grown. But I think most people have challenges. Life is inherently hard for many people, harder for some than it is others. But that's a deep part of who I am, is everything that I've experienced. In a weird way, I've become grateful for all the challenges I face because I wouldn't be the person I am today if I hadn't gone through so many things.
Albert, I really appreciate you sharing that and being very vulnerable with me. I resonate with that a lot. Um, yeah, and yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And maybe we could ask that, for future guests. That's a really good question. Well, this podcast is called Plan Dulce because we believe planning should be nurturing, joyful, and rooted in care. What's something sweet, literal, or symbolic that keeps you grounded in this work?
I really love when you share this question for me, and all I can say is the future we want is possible if we are willing to work in community with people to get us there. And it sounds very woo. I become very sentimental as a middle-aged person, but honestly, love is all we have. And the only things that truly matter in life are not material. And that's our health and the relationships that we have. Everything else stays when we die. And so I encourage people to look inside themselves and give people the benefit of the doubt so we can build genuine community, something that capitalism teaches us not to do because we're supposed to compete. But, this is a very uh, central to my way of being. Collaboration is at the root of all social structures, right? Like that's one of the things that I think a lot about is like we are taught to compete each other and sees everybody else as a threat to our own well-being. But I think that goes against our nature. I think we're taught to think that way. And I think collaboration is the only way we're going to get to that future that we want, which is totally possible. I don't want to be like this pie in the sky saying things that seem impossible, but I look to the history of the Americas. If you, in a weird way, this political moment is what is called the imperial or colonial boomerang. Everything we've done to the third world is coming back to us. And so I look to the examples of dissent and resistance in the Americas, in Chile, Argentina, which are having their own resurgence of conservative politics, but they have gone through authoritarian regimes. And so, and they came out the other side. Mexico is a great example. The 1968 Tlatelolco massacre was like a moment of political repression against youth activists. And Mexico, I think Claudia Sheinbaum has her problems. I'm not saying she's perfect, but where Mexico is now compared to where it was even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, again, I'm not saying Mexico's perfect. It has its problems. But I think that oftentimes we forget that the global south can teach us a lot of lessons. So that's sort of where I look for inspiration.
Thank you. I appreciate you for sharing that. That's it for today's episode of Plan Dulce. Huge thanks to Álvaro for sharing their stories, work, and visions for more inclusive and just planning future. Thank you so much for joining us today and for the incredible work you're creating.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I was just honored that you all even invited me. I hope this talk has resonated with people, not only emotionally, but it maybe incited planners. I have deep respect for people who think about this stuff, and so I hope it's been interesting and useful for folks who are engaged in these issues.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we're all a community together. So I appreciate you bringing that up a lot in our talk. We'll be back soon with more conversations from Latine planners, educators, community leaders, artists, and experts who are reshaping Latine communities. To our listeners, thank you for tuning into Plan Dulce. Don't forget to follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. We'll catch you next time.